So coming off at the end of the previous chapter, we saw that All For One was like nearly being defeated by Izuku until he had like his own little moment of power of friendship, I suppose, where he was like, the entire chain of events up until now will inevitably spill out victory or defeat for all. Victory is still within my grasp. And then we cut over to Spinner at the end of the chapter, and that brings us to the beginning of this one, where we see Spinner leading like this army of like 15,000 heteromorphs, not just remnants of the Paranormal Liberation Front, of course, but like thousands and thousands of just regular civilians. And this goes into what All For One's big plan for Spinner essentially was, where he wanted to build him up into this mascot for this false cause. I mean, the inherent cause is very much legitimate because as this chapter explores the history of prejudice around the heteromorphs in this world, like the people that were born with quirks that alter their appearance. But as for what they're doing here, it's very much false because it's ultimately what All For One wants. And what he wants is for them to break Kurogiri out of the hospital that he's being detained in currently. And I'm pretty sure that they are successfully going to do this one way or another. I don't think they're necessarily going to win this portion of the battle or whatever. I mean, maybe they will, but I think it ultimately ends with Kurogiri being broken out of here because it kind of needs to happen because of Kurogiri's, crazy warping quirk. Because if they do get him out of here, then he'll immediately be able to activate that, and I assume take one or more of the heteromorphic individuals here and then immediately go to UA. And then once they get to UA, then he'll be able to activate the quirk again and take All For One / Shigaraki out of there. And then once he's out of the UA barrier encasement thing, then Aizawa and Monoma will no longer be able to erase his quirks, and then he'll just be able to go ham. Because that's another thing that we haven't seen yet, like the full potential of All For One / Shigaraki with all of the quirks, fully utilizing his new body. Something that he was talking about in the previous chapter, where he was like, surely you jest, I haven't even used a single quirk yet. I have yet to brandish the true value of this body. So yeah, we're definitely going to see this eventually happen, and I think it's going to happen through them breaking out Kurogiri and then Kurogiri breaking All For One / Shigaraki out of there. And also it seems like Izuku is coming to his limit, as it was stated by the second user that he only has like 5 minutes to use the full potential of Gear Shift, and I think he's probably going to reach that limit, pass out, and then that's when we go into, I don't know, the second or third act of this fight where All For One completely takes over and uses the full extent of his power. But as they're all leading to the hospital to take Kurogiri out, we see like there's not a lot of heroes here. There's only about 200 along with police squads, and it's definitely not a coincidence that Horikoshi is using wording here as marching and police squads are like the defense against this. Obviously it parallels to our reality, and like I said, there very much is a legitimate cause behind this, but it's just ultimately being overshadowed by All For One. And I'll get more into why he's so despicable to do this other than just using them in the first place. But they're not really effective against pushing them away because like I said, 200 against 15,000, it's not really going to work out. And even Koda is here trying to fight back, but they wind up just ripping Koda's mask off, calling him like a traitor, saying that he lives in the city because, just like in our world, cities are usually, progressive and more welcoming to accepting everyone despite how different they could be. But when you get outside of the cities and you go into like the small rural areas or towns or whatnot, that's when it gets pretty conservative and the prejudice is really evident. It's very much the same in the My Hero world. But also while this is all happening, we see this masked heteromorph from the Paranormal Liberation Front. We've seen him multiple times, and he's giving this speech, going over everything that we just essentially talked about. But he also says that, the history of the paranormal is a history of violence against what looks different. Order 66, the Great Jedi Purge. Obviously, this is a Star Wars reference, like Order 66 is the order that Palpatine gave to the clones to, flip their switch, and then they suddenly just started taking out all the Jedi. But in this instance, it's referencing this moment in history where like a whole bunch of heteromorphs were just killed seemingly because they look different. Because going further into that, he says, when asked about his reasons, a man that took part in these massacres simply said they were gross. And if we look at this panel of this, Order 66 happening, we could see this guy right here, and I'm pretty sure this is All For One. Like, come on, it looks exactly like him. The same suit, the same proportions of like the jacket and the way that his shirt collar pops over the top of it, same haircut. He's even reaching up his right hand. He doesn't even have a weapon like the others in this panel, and because that's how the All For One quirk works. So yeah, I'm pretty sure this is All For One, meaning that he was the one who orchestrated the whole Order 66, or just the massacre against the heteromorphs. And I'm assuming that this is also taking place back in the day because he says the history of the quote quote-unquote paranormal, because that's like how this was referred to back in the day, along with quirks being called meta abilities and whatnot. So yeah, this is like the big tragic secret to all of this, is that All For One was the one who basically spearheaded prejudice against the heteromorphs. And I also think this makes sense because, you know, as the story goes on, we've seen that All For One is essentially behind everything, right? And another thing about, you know, Order 66, like I said, it was orchestrated by Palpatine, the Dark Emperor of the Empire. And obviously that parallels to All For One, who was like the Palpatine of this series, right? So yeah, pretty crazy, tragic twist. I'm not going to say that he invented prejudice against the heteromorphs, because that's kind of just an inherent aspect of some people for sure. But it seems like he definitely was one of the big reasons, if not the big reason, why there's still like this huge prejudice against heteromorphs in the My Hero world today. I mean, even going so far as to having multiple massacres just because he thought they looked gross. And that goes into him being gross for now using them for his cause. Like, he's just manipulating Spinner. Like, obviously he doesn't care about them. He doesn't care about all of these heteromorphs. Speaking of him using Spinner, we see Spinner in this chapter not even be able to understand what's going on here, because as those speeches are being made, and he's like, I have no idea what they're talking about. Since All For One gave me this power, my mind is going blank. This is in reference to before the war started, All For One like gave Spinner this giant quirk or whatever, and he's like, whatever, I'll just do as I was told and take Kurogiri back. So yeah, I'm pretty sure this means that on top of All For One giving Spinner the giant quirk, he also did something else to make him subservient. It's also necessary because Spinner was never really like All For One's boy. Spinner was more so ride or die for Shigaraki, and he obviously knew that, so he kind of had to do this to make sure that Spinner would do his bidding. But right after this reveal, Shoji suddenly shows up and gives him an octoblow, and Shoji starts trying to be the voice of reason here, despite being called a traitor, of course, which we knew was coming. But he's like, you know, what does attacking the hospital have to do with your cause? You know, back in the first war, when we invaded Jakku Hospital, the heroes made sure that everyone was evacuated first, like before they started attacking the high-end Nomus and Yujiko and all that stuff. And he's like, what about you guys? Have you even thought about that? And then we actually see some of the heteromorphs like, oh, you're right. You know, basically trying to get a point across that, like, you know, you're no better than the people who have been prejudiced and used violence against you. And then we get this, like, little flashback of Shoji when he was younger, seemingly in his hometown, wearing, like, these bandages on his face. We see somebody saying, like, no matter how far we progress, we'll never accept that tainted blood of yours. And I'm pretty sure this is what we heard about Shoji in the Ultra Analysis book, which is also unfortunate because Horikoshi could have very much went into this in the story at some point, but I guess he just didn't because he realized that nobody would care about it. But in the Ultra Analysis book, it says, in Shoji's hometown, there is still prejudice against those whose bodies are altered outwardly by their quirks, and people were often frightened of him. He started wearing his signature mask because his face made a young girl cry, and he didn't want to be the cause of anyone's sadness. But speaking of wearing a mask, at the end of this chapter, his mask comes off. We see his face for the first time in the series, and it's pretty much what we expected, I guess, right? Because the way that the mask forms to his face, it doesn't really leave much to the imagination. But he also has these scars on his face, and I guess this also goes back, you know, how he was treated in his hometown. I'm pretty sure they probably did that to him. But we also saw his face before. If you were able to see like the pre-series sketches that Horikoshi made, I guess, like the rough drafts of the characters, like he pretty much still looks the same to this day aside from the scars. But in reference to him saying, did you guys even think about evacuating people from the hospital? Like, you know, you're going to hurt all of these innocent people. And he's like, well, if the answer is no, well, then I'll never forgive you. And yeah, that's where the chapter ends, and really good stuff here. This was a really interesting chapter, really thought-provoking, and it's just too bad that this for sure isn't going to get a lot of attention. Like, a lot of people aren't going to care about this chapter because it doesn't revolve around Izuku, Bago, or Shoto, but it is what it is. So coming off at the end of the previous chapter, we see Shoji taking on Spinner and his heteromorphic army that are currently marching towards the hospital that's holding Kurogiri. Like, their big mission here is to break him out of there for All For One, which I assume he wants to use Kurogiri's Warpgate quirk to get himself out of UA, where he is currently trapped and being beaten down by Izuku. And Shoji starts questioning them, saying like, you know, are you just going to disregard the safety of all the people in the hospital for what you're doing here? That doesn't really make you any better than the people that you're, you know, protesting and fighting against. And he's like, you know, I swear if the answer is no, I'll never forgive you. And we see Spinner can't even like comprehend fully what's going on here. Like, he can't even speak right. His eyes are like gone. He's drooling. He can't even like fully understand the heteromorphic army that's like cheering him on here. And he's like, no idea. Then we find out why Spinner is so messed up here, because we get a flashback of All For One giving him an extra quirk, or at least I thought it was just an extra quirk, because it appears that All For One gave him 2 extra quirks, which is like insane, because he says, you know, if you're going to use durability, then this one should help. Scale armor. It'll grant you raw strength, heightened defense, and the appearance of a true leader. So I think he gave Spinner a giant quirk, like a quirk that makes him giant, and then this scale armor quirk as well. And like I said, that's pretty crazy because he's basically turning Spinner into like a Nomu here. And I think that's the point that Horikoshi's trying to get across, because he already had like the pupilless eyes and the drooling of the mouth and the tongue hanging out and the, you know, monstrous appearance. And now that he has the scale armor coming over him, he looks, you know, like some version of like a Nomu or something, right? And that goes back to like why Nomus are like that in the first place, because Yujiko had to modify them so that they were capable of holding multiple quirks. And I think that this is the most amount of quirks that we've seen a person hold in the series, outside of like the One For All users, All For One, and then like, you know, Nagant, who had just 2 quirks. But like the formers that I mentioned, it seems like it's okay if you have just like 2 quirks, I guess, right? It doesn't seem to put too much stress on you, but once you start getting into having 3 quirks without like a modified body or anything, then that's when you start to lose your mind, essentially. And I think that's pretty much what we're seeing with Spinner here. He's in the process of completely losing himself because he just has too much power, too many quirks. And this is like the big tragic aspect of Spinner, because he's essentially losing himself to this cause, a cause that he's not even 100% fully on board with, because he was originally doing this for Shigaraki. Like, that's why he accepted to take these extra quirks in the first place, because he was like, it's all for Shigaraki, because that's who he looks up to the most. Like, originally Spinner was like ride or die for Stain. That was like his introduction to the series, like carrying on Stain's will. But as that kind of like died off, he found new purpose in serving Shigaraki and making him take over and whatnot, because he looks up to Shigaraki. He really admires him. You know, they've bonded as the series has gone on. A lot of it off panel, but we've saw some of it in the Villain Academia, and towards the end of the first war, we actually get this flashback of Shigaraki talking to Spinner, saying that like, oh, you used to play League of Legends? Me too, though I always played solo. And we knew that Spinner was a gamer in that one flashback that we got of him, but we also knew that Shigaraki was a gamer as well, and that's what him and Spinner bonded over, because back in chapter 298, after All For One takes over Shigaraki's body and does like the successful raid on Tartarus, you know, they come back to this meeting point with the League of Villains, and it's at this point that they realize, especially Spinner, that All For One has taken over Shigaraki's body. And Spinner says, we got along more than I thought, bonded over gaming and stuff. It's like, who are you? You're not the guy I agreed to follow. So it's like, yeah, it's just really tragic here that Spinner is doing what he feels is the right thing. Like, Spinner had a hard life growing up, just like Shoji did. That's like, you know, the big theme of this whole battle here. It's that they both had hard upbringings. Maybe Shoji a little more than Spinner. You know, Shoji going the path of being a hero, Spinner going the path of being a villain, ultimately being used by All For One. And it makes me wonder, is like, Spinner even going to be able to survive this? Because, you know, in theory, All For One could just take the 2 quirks back, and then he would just, I guess, revert back to normal. But it's like, did he sustain lasting brain damage from this? And if All For One doesn't do that, or Shigaraki, then it's like, how does he come back from this? Unless he just ultimately winds up dying here, which would be really sad and tragic, but I could see that happening. But I think it would be more fitting if Shigaraki, or Izuku, if he winds up taking the All For One quirk, you know, reverts Spinner back to being normal again, or, you know, normal for Spinner. But going into the Shoji side of things, we're getting a flashback on him in this chapter, actually a couple. So the first one is that at some point we see that he actually revealed his face to Class 1A and told them that, like, you know, he comes from, as he says, a backwater village where pure blood was so important that they'd even take up arms to children to keep things pure. So that's why he has the scars on his face, because he was straight up abused by the citizens of this village, which is, you know, awful. And it's been going into what we've been talking about, how in the My Hero world, like, the cities are more progressive and accepting of the heteromorphs, but like the more rural, you know, backwater village or towns or whatnot are way more conservative, so like to a crazy point to where they're just like, we'll kill even children if they're heteromorphs. And since Shoji had these scars, that's why he decided to wear the mask, because he didn't want people to think that he was out for retribution, which is like understandable. And then while he has like a ton of painful memories and no way that he can ever really forget them, he chooses to remember the big happy memory of his youth, and that's when he was able to save this girl from drowning because of the quirk that he has. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to reach her. And in that moment, he was overjoyed to have that body. And I guess this is also what led him to becoming a hero ultimately. Like, he realized that he can use this to save people rather than seeing it as a detriment that weighs him down. And he embraces everybody. We have this nice moment, and it comes back to the present where Shoji reveals that his goal is that he wants to stop the prejudice in the world, because he's like, I don't think that over a century of prejudice will be over in our lifetime, which is very true and realistic for sure. But he's like, he wants to become the world's coolest hero and then pass on that good memory onto the next generation. And I think that's great. It's just too bad that Horikoshi has decided to reveal this at the very end here. Like, for example, we got Kirishima's backstory way back in the Overhaul arc, and it's like he could have gave Shoji this development sometime after that, and I think it would have been better to build up characters like this throughout the story rather than just shoehorn it all in at the end. But it is what it is. I guess better late than never, I'm just appreciative that he's at least doing this much. But Spinner, hearing this, still can't comprehend it, because he's like losing his mind here, and he's just like, I don't care, tear it down, and he keeps going after Shoji. And I think Shoji is about to like do his ultimate move or something, because like suddenly like all of this flesh starts wrapping around his arm with like these eyeballs in it, and Spinner's like, that's disgusting. And Shoji's like, what can I say? It's just who I am. And he's about to just nail him with like this huge fist thing. I assume it's going to be huge once he unleashes it in the next chapter, and this might be like his ultimate move, or maybe even awakening or something, because it looks like Koda is getting some kind of awakening or something too. Like, he's sprouting horns from his head in this chapter as he's taking on that Paranormal Liberation Front guy, who I assume is going to be his final opponent. But yeah, that's pretty much where the chapter ends. Like I said, this might have a tragic ending here. I mean, I do think that there's some way that they're going to get Kurogiri out of that hospital, because he kind of has to get us to the next portion of where Shigaraki / All for One is fully unleashed. But as for Spinner, it might be too late for him, but at the same time I hope not, because I think Spinner's a cool character and he deserves to be redeemed, I think, more so than Toga and Dabi. So coming off the end of the previous chapter, we saw Shoji and Koda ostensibly doing like their ultimate moves, I suppose. I mean, they might have like another true ultimate after this, considering it's not over, but this is the strongest thing that we've seen them do so far. And coming into the beginning of this chapter, we're seeing like what they are. So Shoji's move is called the Octo Expansion, where he creates like this Resident Evil arm and just launches like this massive strike, and it winds up hitting Spinner, and it seems to be affecting him for sure. But on the other side of Spinner, Present Mike is also hitting him with like a sound blast. And while I appreciate the teamwork here, Present Mike is still kind of like stealing Shoji's thunder in this sequence, because this is like Shoji's big moment. This is like his big fight. It's like, Present Mike, go do something else. But for Koda, we're seeing that his ultimate move is also tied to like, I guess, his quirk evolution possibly, or just what his quirk inevitably was always supposed to be, because in the previous chapter we saw him like sprout these horns, and now we're getting a flashback to when he was talking to his mother when he was younger, and she's like, Koji, one day you may also grow horns. They allow our feelings to reach animals even if they're far away. And the one other time that we saw Shoji's mom in the series, she did have those horns, so it's like, yeah, Horikoshi using the full cow here. And this essentially just gives Koda just a broader radius to use his animal manipulation ability. And his quote-unquote ultimate here is called the Hitchcock Birds. And yeah, a little on the nose Horikoshi, but it is what it is. And it just summons like a swarm of birds, and they all go after that Paranormal Liberation Front top heteromorph guy that we've been seeing intermittently throughout these last couple chapters, trying to egg on the crowd here, trying to keep them with their cause. But I guess this is Koda like defeating him probably, because we don't see him again after this. But going further, after we see Shoji hit Spinner, he's like, what do you want to protect with that giant body and those scales of yours? And then talking to the crowd, he's like, you guys too, what do you want to protect with those amazing powers you have? Don't give in to your wounds, because then your children will be their next target. Saying like, hey, if you continue to do this, the prejudice against you is only going to get worse. Don't let revenge consume you. It's like, try to do as I am. Like, try to be better than those who have persecuted you. Because if you just react with violence like this, then you're essentially lowering yourself to where they were, and you're no better. But Spinner's like recovering here, and he's like, hatred will never disappear. Even if the heroes win this, nothing will change. And that is technically true. Like, regardless if the heroes win or lose here, it's not like everyone's just going to be cool with heteromorphs now. I mean, of course, it's better if the heroes do win, but in order for this reform to take place, it's going to take many years. And that goes into what Shoji's ultimate goal for being a hero was. He wanted to become a hero that was so cool that it would influence future generations to not have prejudice against heteromorphs anymore. And eventually it would get to a point of where everyone is accepted. But then we get another glimpse into Spinner's past as he's saying this. And he's like, even if we stay hidden on the shadows, people will still spray us with pesticide. And it's like, yeah, this apparently happened to Spinner. Like, he also faced serious prejudice, just like Shoji, although not as extreme as Shoji, I guess, but still to the point of where we could see that Spinner was clearly depressed for a large part of his life. Like, he was just a shut-in playing video games. You know, his room was just filthy. And this is another reason why Spinner was so on board with Stain's cause and why he latched onto that and became like a Stain stan, and then eventually became a Shigaraki stan, because he just wants a cause to latch onto, something that will give him purpose. You know, he doesn't want to be a nobody, as we'll come to find out. If they attack us, we strike back. Comrades, raise your voice and follow me. And then he like launches off of building and launches straight towards the hospital. And Shoji's like, he's even stronger now? My attack can even destroy concrete. And at first you're thinking like, well, that's not really that impressive. But then we also have to remember that we've kind of been desensitized by like Izuku and Bakugo, Kirishima, and all of these way overpowered characters, that they're like the outliers of the outliers that, you know, Class 1A is already comprised of. So like Shoji being able to produce an attack that can destroy concrete is still really impressive, but it's just not everybody is on the level of like the top 5 students essentially. But Spinner winds up successfully breaking through the front of the hospital here. And then he remembers back to what All For One had told him before the war had started, and he's like, Kurogiri must be at the research tower. You reach him, play a recording of mine or Tomura's voice. Kurogiri's quirk will end this war. So I know I've said this many times, forgive me, but just for the people that are new here, I assume that All For One somehow knew that he would be in this situation more or less. Even if he didn't, he just thinks that Kurogiri's quirk is essential to his plan or non-plan. But in this instance at least, Spinner can have Kurogiri activate his Warp Gate quirk and break All For One / Shigaraki out of UA, where he's currently trapped, you know, having his quirks erased by Aizawa and Monoma and being, you know, severely beaten down by Izuku. So if in theory he gets out of there, he can just go full power and turn the war back in the favor of the villains. But then also using, you know, Warp Gate further, he can just bring all the villains together, which are currently, you know, scattered. But as Spinner and the heteromorphic Bob are like breaking into the hospital here, they see like all of the doctors and nurses like standing united to stop them from going any further. And the heteromorphs are like seeing the doctors doing this, but they're also seeing them tending to patients and whatnot. And they're like, whoa, I didn't sign up for this. You know, I'm fighting for reform here. I'm not trying to just hurt innocent people. And this goes back to what Shoji was telling them in, I think, chapter 370, when they were like holding Shoji down, and he's like, you know, what's any of that got to do with attacking the hospital? You know, back in the first war, the heroes made sure that the patients and staff were safe before, you know, we engaged in the battle against Yujiko and the Nomus and everything. And this got through to a lot of the heteromorphs at that time. They're like, whoa, you're kind of right. And now it's just fully gone through to them. They're like, yeah, we're not about this. And they all essentially peace out. And as we see Spinner advancing through the hospital, in this sequence, he's depicted as like his younger self, like happily running. And he's like, you know, I always thought I'd be nobody, but if I reach Kurogiri, then I'll become someone. You know, look, Shigaraki, look how many people follow me. And then when he turns around, you know, nobody's there. He's just by himself now. And it goes more into like the tragic fate of Spinner. You know, this is what he's become, along with allowing All For One to give him 2 extra quirks, which turns him essentially into like this Nomu thing, where he can't even speak properly. And then we see President Mike behind him, and he's like, Shoji's voice has reached them, and he won't be your trump card, referring to Kurogiri. And then in the final double spread here, we see charging Kurogiri, who's like right in front of them, and Spinner's like, you know, Kurogiri, and President Mike's like, Shirakumo, and that's where the chapter ends. And it's like, okay, so who's going to get through to him here? Is Spinner going to play the recording and like Manchurian Candidate activate Kurogiri and Warp Gate Shigaraki / All For One out of UA? Or is President Mike going to get through to him and then have Shirakumo come through once again? Because we saw that that was kind of a thing, or at least Horikoshi was setting it up to be a thing. Because when President Mike and Aizawa were first trying to get through to Kurogiri, we saw that Shirakumo was kind of coming through. He just couldn't fully do it yet. So to be honest, I think the former is going to happen here. Like, I do think Spinner is going to play that recording, and then he is going to warp All For One / Shigaraki out of there and probably bring the villains together as well. But I think eventually Shirakumo will come through Kurogiri, and then we'll just have Shirakumo again as a hero helping them eventually, like before the series is over, but just not right now. But so coming off of the end of the previous chapter, we saw Spinner and Present Mike entering the hospital going after Kurogiri, both trying to save him in their own way. Spinner trying to play this recording of either All for One or Shigaraki, which is going to activate Kurogiri, and in theory he could use his quirk to free All for One from UA where he's currently trapped. But on the other hand, Present Mike is just simply trying to stop that from happening and possibly even bring Shirakumo through Kurogiri. And that brings us to the beginning of this chapter, where we're kind of seeing a little flashback as to Present Mike telling Shoji that, Spinner entered the hospital, I'll go after him, while Shoji and Koda are still dealing with the heteromorphic army here. And we see that Koda has pretty much defeated that Paranormal Liberation Front general guy and has him like handcuffed on the ground. And Shoji's about to be hit by one of the heteromorphs who's very tentative, and he's suddenly stopped by the pig guy that we saw in the previous chapter entering the hospital with Spinner. And he's finally coming around here, and he realizes what they're doing is wrong. He's like, I don't think I'm making good use of my rage. I'm thinking about it. I've been attacked multiple times for no reason, and I won't deny that I got excited over the call to action, and I thought it was finally time to strike back on the world that has mistreated us, but I don't know anymore. Is the whole world really my enemy? Now I feel like there's some people that I don't want to cause any harm to. And what really got through to the pig guy and the others is when they eventually did break into the hospital with Spinner, they saw the doctors and the nurses like standing united trying to protect the patient. They realize that this isn't what I want to do. Yes, we want reform. Yes, we don't want to be mistreated and face prejudice anymore, but this just isn't the way. These people are innocent. And then we see everyone is basically coming around to this reasoning. Even the army that's outside of the hospital is stopping. And Shoji's like, the feeling that gathered you all here today was neither wrong nor useless. The fact that no one has ever shown light on us has hurt us immensely for a long time, but you kept on fighting without giving up on thinking. And to me, you were shining brightly throughout it. Let's use that light to change the people who hurt us so that they'll feel ashamed to ever raise their fists against us again. And that's kind of like the final nail in the coffin here. Shoji has finally gotten through to everyone, and everyone's starting to realize that he's right. We shouldn't be doing this, because we have to remember that this army isn't comprised of villains. Actually just a small portion of it is the Paranormal Liberation Front and other random heteromorph villains, but the majority of the mob here are just civilians that they were manipulating to get onto this false cause. And it's essentially stopped here, assuming that this is going to be the end of this heteromorphic army march sequence, because even Lockrock's all we were thinking about was how to overcome them by force. They didn't even consider trying to reason with them. But then he's reinforcements move out to the hospital, so they're going to be entering the hospital now. But speaking of that, we're coming back to Spinner and Present Mike, and Spinner's being blasted by one of Present Mike's sound waves, and the recorder with All for One and Shigaraki's voice that he was supposed to play to Kurogiri gets damaged here, and Spinner just falls down and he kind of reverts back to his normal form. And I'm assuming that this is a combination of exhaustion from using multiple quirks, like the giant quirk and the scale armor quirk, but also the damage that he's received. But he's still kind of in that brain damage state where he can't think clearly, he can't speak clearly, and he's my mind's blank, my body won't obey me. And he's looking up at Kurogiri, and he's thinking back to sad moments in his life, and he's all I ever wanted was to keep following him to where he is right now, referring to Shigaraki, of course. And we see that he has the last burnt Shigaraki hand. We saw that he had this at the end of the previous war, and he used this to comfort Shigaraki as they were being taken away. And his plan here is to essentially use this in place of the recorder. But while this is happening, Present Mike is also marching towards Kurogiri, and he's thinking to himself, saying hey Shirakumo, did you know that Aizawa lost an eye and a leg, in reference to Aizawa taking on Shigaraki in the previous war. He's so please don't make him lose the good memories he has. If you're not Shirakumo anymore, I'd like you to disappear as a memory, but if you're still our friend from back then. And I think this is Horikoshi kind of establishing that there's a chance that both of the possibilities with Kurogiri will play out. Either he will just be Kurogiri, Shirakumo is done forever, and he's just going to disappear as a memory. But there's also a chance that Shirakumo can still be brought back somehow. Both options aren't off the table here. here. But afterwards, Spinner is able to like forcefully get up, remembering like the crucial moments between him and Shigaraki. And he winds up picking up the burnt hand and puts it towards Kurogiri's face. And he's like, let's save Shigaraki and the others. And then suddenly Kurogiri gets up from the chair, but he's kind of like in this in-between state that we haven't really seen before, where now we see like parts of Shirakumo's body, like his hand, his shoulder, and also part of his face, like what we saw before. And he says, I am the one who protects Tomura Shigaraki. The narrator says, Kurogiri joins the battle, the war reaches a new stage, and that's where the chapter ends. So when I first read these spoilers, I thought it was more clear cut as to where Kurogiri was just the dominant personality, and then after this, he's going to use his quirk to break All For One / Shigaraki out of UA. But now it doesn't seem that it's that simple, because when he's saying I am, in Japanese he's saying ore, which is Shirakumo's first person pronoun. So he's like saying I am the one who protects Tomura Shigaraki, as if it's like Shirakumo saying this. So it might be that he's in like this in-between state. I don't think he's fully Shirakumo and he's kind of just putting on an act, because like why would he have to do that in this situation? I do think that he's kind of like in between right now, because it reflects the form that we see him in. But it seems like the more dominant personality, not completely taking over, but more of it is Kurogiri, because he kind of has to be at this moment. I mean, there is a chance that Shirakumo just comes through right now and doesn't save All For One / Shigaraki, but then that would just mean that it's the end, essentially, right? And that we would have to take what the narrator is saying here at the end in a different way. The war reaches a new stage, not necessarily in an exciting sense, but more so that the new stage is that it's over or ending, because if Shigaraki / All For One continues to stay stuck in UA as he is, then Izuku is just going to defeat him, because that's the trajectory of that battle right now. So I'm thinking that Kurogiri is going to break him out of there, and then once Shigaraki / All For One's out of there, he's free to use his full power, because Aizawa Monoma won't be able to erase his quirk anymore, and we also haven't seen him use his full power yet, and it's going to be crazy. And also, it was kind of set up that like we kind of have to see it, because that's what he was talking about before, which led us to him saying that he needs to essentially be saved by Spinner and Kurogiri here. And when that happens, I think Izuku is also going to gas out or pass out, because the second user told him that he only basically has 5 minutes to be able to use gear shift manner that he is, because it's just too much. And I'm thinking that this is all going to happen, and that's how we should take the narrator's statement here. Kurogiri joins the battle, the war reaches a new stage. So yeah, it seems like that's likely, but I do think in the end Shirakumo is going to come through and break from the Kurogiri-ness that's happened to him and eventually join the side of the heroes and help them, but just not right now. So at the beginning of this chapter, we see present Mike and Kurogiri, and that's because at the end of the previous, Spinner was able to successfully get through to Kurogiri by placing Shigaraki's Nana hand on his face, because apparently it turns out that All For One put some kind of microchip into Nana's hand to make sure that Kurogiri would instantly move even if he didn't know what was currently happening. And it's like, okay, this totally lines up with Horikoshi's writing of All For One, because like Spinner originally had like that voice recording that he was supposed to play for Kurogiri, but Present Mike damaged that, so of course he knew that was going to happen, so he put a microchip into Nana's hand, and that would activate him, which it has. So that means that the villains are definitely going to be moved around by Kurogiri's Warp Gate quirk, which we're going to see in this chapter. But we're cutting away to this weather forecast in America, and it's focusing on this super large cloud that's going over Japan. It even has the potential to influence weather in America, but this is like from all of the battles that have been going on, mainly just Shoto, Dabi, and Endeavor. All of those, heat explosions are causing like this massive cloud to appear, and I think that this is probably going to play a big part going forward, because I think this might be the second time this is mentioned, and we see it like approaching the hospital, where they were just coming off of. And it's also brought up again later on in the chapter when we see Manuel, Monoma, and Aizawa like feeling the effects of it. So yeah, like I said, I think this is going to come into play later. Maybe All For One tries to manipulate it or something, possibly. Not really sure. So then we're cutting over to Kamino with the battle between Dabi and Shoto. We haven't seen them in a while. Shoto and Dabi had kind of already like had their final battle, and it seemed like Shoto had won at first, but then no, somehow Dabi was able to like revive himself and started using his own flash fire fist and got like a second win from that, I guess. But it's coming back to Dabi just somehow still being able to fight, because they're like all exhausted and they could barely stand, but Dabi is just still going full power despite that. And it's pretty much because of what Burning says here. She's like, he's broken past the limits of his power through sheer force of will. And it's like, yeah, that's what he's doing. And going further, she's like, wasn't his body like super weak to fire? And it is, because his body is on its last leg at this moment. Even Dabi realizes it, because he's like, if I stick to my original plan of defeating Shoto and bringing him as a present to Endeavor, his body won't hold up. So yeah, I don't expect us to see Dabi much longer, unless Eri like rewinds him or something, but this does seem like this is Dabi's like death tour at this moment. And he decides to try to fly off to where Endeavor is at Gunga, because he found that out from Skeptic a couple chapters back. But speaking of Skeptic, he's like, it seems like you're getting a free ride, and a Kurogiri warp gate opens in front of Dabi, which is of course going to take him to where Endeavor is. But we cut away from that for a second because we're going back to UA, and like I said, we see Manuel, Monoma, and Aizawa, who are currently erasing All for One / Shigaraki's quirks, being disrupted by the weather that's going on, and they're still able to continue erasing All for One's quirks at the moment. And we're seeing like a small glimpse of what he and Izuku were doing, and it's pretty much just the same thing that was happening the last time we saw him, I think in chapter 369, when Izuku was beating All for One / Shigaraki down so bad that he just started to become like bulbous. And that's when we cut over to Spinner, who eventually had succeeded in what he needed him to do, you know, warping the villains to different places and whatnot, but also getting rid of Monoma, Aizawa, and Manuel erasing his quirks, because that's the next warp gate we see open. It's right behind them. And Present Mike's coming through this one as well, and it seems like Kurogiri is too. So I'm not really sure who else he's going to bring through this warp gate to potentially take down Monoma and Aizawa, but considering that it looks like Kurogiri is in this gate, it's possible that this might be like Present Mike and Aizawa, and maybe even Monoma's like final battle, them taking on Kurogiri, but also of course trying to bring Shirakumo through, which they probably will successfully do eventually. But either way, I think this is going to disrupt the erasure that's happening, and we're finally going to get to see All for One / Shigaraki like use his full power, something we haven't seen yet. So then we cut back to Endeavor and Hawks taking on All for One, and he realizes that Spinner has succeeded, and suddenly another warp gate opens up, and this time it's Dabi confronting Endeavor. He's like, hey there, Dad. But then there's another gate that opens, and it's freaking twice. But not only twice, it's twice with a twice clone. And All for One's like a sad man's death planted a seed of hatred in a young girl's heart. And of course, this is referencing Toga, who had a strong relationship with Twice, maybe the strongest of all of the League of Villains. And of course, Hawks killed Twice in the original war, and Toga also like watched Twice as he died too. But also a couple chapters back, it was revealed that Dabi was able to get some of Twice's blood, and he gave it to Toga, and we assume that, oh, this means that she's going to obviously take in Twice's blood, be able to use his quirk, and then use like his ultimate Sad Man's Parade ability. Seems like it's all coming to fruition. I don't know if she's used Sad Man's Parade yet, but she clearly has taken in Twice's blood, become him, and then has already used his quirk to duplicate herself, or himself. And the Twice clone coming through the gate seems to be holding maybe a piece of Tsuyu's goggles, meaning that they probably defeated her, because Uraraka and Tsuyu were taking on Toga last time we left off on that side of the battle. But it looks like Toga / Twice has won here. But going further, All for One's like, shall we see Takami? What would have happened last time if you hadn't disposed of him so quickly? And the end of the chapter, Hawks is like, we have to kill him now. And of course, Twice's quirk is so busted. Like, not only just becoming the Sad Man's Parade, you know, multiplying himself hundreds if not thousands of times, he can also duplicate other super powerful individuals. Like the first threat that Hawks saw was him duplicating the High and Nomus, but now that Twice is here with All for One and Dabi, he might duplicate them. Like duplicate Dabi as he's dying, get the most out of him. But then could you imagine if she duplicates All for One, who is also kind of dying at the moment? He's on limited time because of the experimental rewind quirk thing that he did, so it's eventually going to rewind him to nothingness, but he still has some time on the clock to, you know, mess people up. So yeah, it's looking like this is all going to maybe happen soon, which would be incredible. I mean, it would be a little too powerful, of course. Maybe not so much the Dabis, but, you know, cloning tons of All for Ones, that would just be too much. So I'm thinking more so the Dabi stuff is going to happen maybe, but absolute minimum, the Sad Man's Parade is full-blown going to happen. But yeah, this is going to be like the shift in the war where it goes back into the side of the villains again. And also, as I've been saying these last couple videos, I do think Izuku is going to pass out really soon due to him using Gear Shift for 5 minutes, which is like the limit that he's at the moment. But then maybe Bakugo wakes up at that point, and then he takes over the shift of trying to take on All for One / Shigaraki. But let me know what you think about this chapter in the comments, guys, and if you liked the video, please give it a like, and please subscribe if you haven't already. Have a great day, and I'll see you next.